Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into the story of a man we all think we know, Christopher Columbus. But it's one of those stories that's packed with rhymes and legends, and in history that's way more complex, and honestly, way more interesting than what most of us learned in school. So let's peel back the layers and see what's really going on.
So who was Christopher Columbus, really? Because on one hand, we've got this picture of the heroic explorer, right? The guy who bravely sailed into the unknown. But then, there's this other picture. The historical figure who was arrested for being a tyrant, stripped of his titles, and sent back to Spain in chains. How can one person be both of these things? That's the puzzle we're going to try to solve.
All right, so first up, let's talk about the version of the story we're all familiar with. It's the simple one, the catchy one, the one that even has its own rhyme.
Yeah, you know it. And this little poem usually comes with a story to match, that Columbus was this brave genius who had to prove to everyone that the earth was round. The story goes that everyone else thought it was flat and that he'd just sail right off the edge. It's this great tale of a forward-thinking hero against a superstitious world.
But here is the big question. Did he actually need to prove that? Was that really what people were arguing about back then? Well, the short answer is nope, not at all.
Okay, so check this out. This shows what the actual debate was. Educated people in the 15th century totally knew the Earth was a sphere. They'd known that since the time of the ancient Greeks. The argument wasn't about the Earth's shape, it was about its size. Columbus was arguing that the Earth was tiny and that Asia was just a quick trip across the ocean. The scholars he debated said, no way, the planet is much bigger and that ocean is way too big to cross. And guess what? The scholars were right.
So get this. Columbus wasn't seen as some scientific visionary. To a lot of experts, he was a guy with really bad math who was about to lead his crew on a suicide mission. The only reason he succeeded was because he got incredibly lucky and literally ran into two massive continents that no one in Europe even knew were there. His big discovery was a complete accident. So if the story we learned in school is mostly a myth, what does the real historical record, the actual documents from his time, tell us? Let's dig into the primary sources, including Columbus's own words, and see what they have to say.
This is straight from Columbus's own journal, written just a few days after he first landed. He talked about how the native Taíno people were generous and good-looking, but look at where his mind went immediately. He wasn't thinking about them as a new culture to learn from. He was sizing them up as a potential workforce. Good servants, he wrote, who could be easily conquered.
And that thought in his journal quickly became official policy. When he became governor, Columbus set up something called the Encomienda system. Now, on paper, it was supposed to be about protecting the native people and teaching them about Christianity. But in reality, it was a brutal system of forced labor. Basically, it was slavery in everything but name.
Then there was the gold tribute system he created. Every Taíno adult had to bring him a certain amount of gold every 3 months. The problem was, there just wasn't that much gold on the island. It was an impossible task. And the punishment for failure was just horrific. Their hands were cut off, and they were left to bleed to death. This system completely shattered their society.
His time as governor got so brutal and so chaotic, it wasn't just the Taíno who were suffering. Even the Spanish colonists started complaining to the king and queen of Spain. So, in the year 1500, the Spanish crown set over an official investigator. He was so horrified by what he found that he arrested Columbus and his brothers on the spot and had them shipped back to Spain in chains.
And we know exactly why. A report from that investigation gives us the grim details. It says Columbus and his brothers ruled like tyrants, using torture on everybody, not just the natives, but the Spanish settlers too. He wasn't removed from power because he was cruel to the indigenous people, which is sad to say. He was removed because he was a terrible, brutal administrator who was messing up the whole colonial project for Spain.
So this all begs a massive question, right? If the actual historical records from his own time paint this picture of a failed, tyrannical governor, how in the world did he become the great American hero we all know from the rhyme?
Well, here's the thing. For almost 300 years after he died, Columbus was, nobody really talked about him. He wasn't a hero. His story got a major makeover in the late 1700s, right after the American Revolution, when the brand new United States needed a hero of its own.
See, the U.S. had just won its independence from England, but all of its founding stories were English. They needed a non-English hero, someone whose story started before the English ever showed up. Columbus, an Italian guy who sailed for Spain, was the perfect fit. And that's why Columbia became a poetic name for the country and why the new capital city was built in the District of Columbia. But the person who really cemented the legend was a writer named Washington Irving. Now, Irving wasn't a historian. He was America's first great fiction writer. You know, the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. In 1828, he wrote a biography of Columbus that became a massive bestseller. But it was more story than history. He basically thought the real facts were boring, so he jazzed them up.
And this is the absolute key to the whole myth. That famous scene of Columbus bravely arguing with ignorant scholars who thought the world was flat? It never happened. Washington Irving made the whole thing up. He invented it to make Columbus look like a modern hero of science and reason, battling against old medieval superstitions. And that piece of fiction is what ended up being taught as history in schools for more than 100 years.
So Irving invents this hero, and then something interesting happens. That invented hero becomes incredibly important to real people for very personal reasons. So let's talk about how this happened and why we still argue about Columbus so fiercely today.
So fast forward to the late 1800s and early 1900s. Immigrants from Italy and other Catholic countries were coming to the U.S. and facing just awful discrimination. To fight for their place in America, groups like the Knights of Columbus championed Columbus. He was an Italian, he was a Catholic, and he was a founding father. He was their proof that people like them belonged in the American story from the very beginning. He became a hugely important symbol of pride.
But of course, that's just one side of the coin. What does the story of Columbus's arrival mean if you're not looking from the ships, but from the shore?
From an indigenous point of view, you can't discover a place that's already home to millions of people, with their own complex societies and cultures. The word discovery itself was kind of a legal trick used by Europeans. It allowed them to claim land that wasn't inhabited by Christians, as if the people who had lived there for centuries simply didn't count.
And this really gets to the heart of the conflict today. On one side, you have history as heritage. For many Italian Americans, Columbus is a powerful symbol of courage and pride. On the other side, you have history as trauma. For indigenous peoples, he's a symbol of colonization, the man whose arrival kicked off centuries of enslavement, disease, and genocide. Both of these histories are powerful, and both are deeply felt.
So who was Christopher Columbus? Well, it kind of depends on when you ask. In his own time, he was a failed governor. In the 1800s, he was a heroic character in a best-selling book. In the 1900s, he was a proud symbol for immigrants. And today, for many, he represents invasion and genocide. His story has been reshaped over and over to meet the needs of the time.
And really, that's where we are now. The debate about Columbus isn't just about a guy who lived 500 years ago. It's about us, today. The stories we choose to tell about our past say a whole lot about the kind of country and the kind of people we want to be right now. So the question isn't just, who was Columbus? It's, what do we want his story to be now? Thanks for watching.